Middle school grads are not taken seriously because of this. In any case, the work of people like you is useless. Gerald, the president, took advantage of his advanced education to make fun of me for barely completing middle school, despite the fact that I oversee all of the systems that this business depends on. That information could not have mattered more to him. "You're fired, middle school graduate," he eventually replied, raising his voice. "Go ahead and delete everything on that computer." I was tired and said, "All right." Gerald mocked the system I created, calling it a bunch of bullshit, even as I stood there. If that's the case, then, despite my years of loyalty, I'm done. I made the decision to erase every last system. Don't hold back. Gerald didn't know. He was unaware of the type of system I had established and the consequences for the business in its absence. His self-satisfied grin would soon fade. Ryan is my name. For the past 10 years, I have been employed at this id company as an engineer. Although I'm only 25, 10 years may seem like a long time to be with the same firm. I joined this company immediately after middle school instead of attending high school. I have many coworkers that are older than me, but are officially my juniors, despite the fact that I am just 25. It was undoubtedly uncomfortable at first to try to figure out how to handle them. They were in agreement. Therefore, it was unpleasant and awkward for us both. However, I've become accustomed to it and no longer find it particularly bothersome. I seem more mature than my age would indicate, according to my coworkers. Perhaps that is simply the outcome of 10 years of employment here. I'm not necessarily a horrible employee just because I didn't complete my education. I know that sounds cocky, but I genuinely think I've contributed to this business. Ultimately, I am essentially in charge of overseeing the entire system infrastructure by myself. Skills and the caliber of the work are far more important in this business than degree or rank. I've gained the self-assurance to be proud of my abilities after 10 years. I am now entering my 10th year of employment under some somewhat unusual conditions. So why did I wind up starting a job right out of middle school? It all stems from an incident that occurred when I was a young child. My mother passed away in a vehicle accident when I was in 7th grade. She kept the house together and was generally in good health. Then one day, she simply vanished. It was just my father and me because I had no siblings. We weren't very close, and Dad was constantly at work and rarely at home. Our family life became stressful and strained when we were left alone together. Therefore, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays are when I'll do the laundry. Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays are your days off. Are you okay with us each doing our own dishes and cleaning? My mom had always taken care of everything, so neither of us had ever done any housekeeping before. As a result, we divided up the tasks as evenly as possible. However, it turns out that until we actually attempt housework, we have no idea how difficult it is. It wasn't simple at all. Our clothes were always wrinkled, and the house kept getting messier even when we thought we were cleaning. Since neither of us could cook, we had to rely on takeout and food from the convenience shop. Months passed during that time, yet my connection with my father remained uneasy. We rarely spoke, even when we were both at home at the same time. We just experienced this uneasy tension. Living like that every day, it was only natural that my mood kept sinking lower and lower. Eventually, I started dreading being at home, craving excitement, distraction, and crowds. I started staying out late, running around with the wrong crowd, late nights hanging around convenience stores and messing around at karaoke bars. It wasn't exactly fun, but it was enough to distract me. That's when I met someone. His name was Ralph, and he became a close friend. Ralph was 2 years older than me, and he was the kind of guy who looked out for others. He always checked in on me when I seemed bored or down, and he'd tell me right away if something interesting came up. He often invited me out for food or just to hang out. And like me, Ralph had lost his mother when he was young. We had that in common, and it made us click right away. For someone like me, who never felt at ease at home, spending time with Ralph meant I could finally be myself. But then something happened. Ralph got seriously injured in a fight with some delinquents. I'd started hanging out with rougher people and getting into more fights, but I was never actually good at fighting. All I could do was puff myself up and try to look intimidating. That night was no different. I was there, but I was barely able to defend myself. There was no way I could fight my way over to help Ralph, who was being attacked by several guys. We were outmatched in numbers, age, and size. We got completely beaten down. After they were done, the other guys just walked off like nothing happened. I dragged my aching body over to Ralph, who was slumped on the ground. I checked on him. The injuries were worse than I thought. I called an ambulance right away. Ralph was rushed to the hospital. My injuries were relatively minor, so after they patched me up, I stayed with him as his companion. Ralph's condition was bad. He wasn't just injured, he was unconscious. That's when a man came rushing in. He looked pale and deeply worried. That was Ralph's father. Ralph had told me before that his father ran a small factory in town. He looked worn down and thin, and there was a clear sense of exhaustion in the air around him. And now, his son was lying in the hospital, beaten and unconscious. There was a heavy sadness in the way he spoke with the nurses. He didn't look anything like Ralph, who had that cool modern vibe. "You're the one who called the ambulance, right?" A friend of his. "Thank you." "No, I'm sorry. I couldn't do anything to stop it. I'm the reason he got hurt." "No, not at all. I was more worried that Ralph dragged you into this mess. Are you okay?" Ralph's pale-faced father spoke to me gently, checking to see if I was okay. The stiff, stern impression he gave at first gradually softened the more we talked. Ugh. While we were talking, Ralph slowly regained consciousness. He let out a soft groan as he tried to sit up, his face contorting in pain. "Ralph, you're awake." Before I could say anything, his father called out to him. Ralph looked at the voice and, with a hint of surprise, clicked his tongue and muttered, "Why'd you even come?" I'm sure his father heard those words too, but he didn't react at all. In fact, he broke down in tears, saying, "I'm just so glad you're alive. I was so scared. I thought something would happen to you." His father was overwhelmed with relief, crying from the bottom of his heart. Watching him, Ralph grumbled, "You're being dramatic," or "Quit being so loud," but he looked a little shy and honestly kind of happy. Then my father showed up a little late. He checked on me, Ralph, and his father to make sure we were all okay, then made some small talk. Still feeling awkward around him, I looked away when he tried to meet my eyes, but he kept looking at me and asked, "Are you hurt? What happened?" I gave him a rough rundown of everything that had gone down. I felt more and more uneasy as I talked, expecting to get scolded. And sure enough, once I finished explaining, he snapped. "What were you thinking? Doing something so dangerous?" I knew I'd gotten hurt, that things had gone too far, and that it had been dangerous. "I got it, so please just stop yelling." I was just about to say that when I looked up and caught a glimpse of my father's face. He was scolding me with his words, but his expression looked like he was about to burst into tears. When I said that, his face crumpled, and his shoulders began to shake. Then he hugged me and said, "If anything ever happened to you, I don't know how I'd go on." It was the first time in a long while I felt my father's warmth. We'd been avoiding each other out of awkwardness, but deep down, my father had always cared about me. Realizing that made me feel overwhelmed with guilt for all the worry I'd caused him. After that incident, Ralph and I turned things around. We started going to school properly and stopped staying out so late. We still had complicated feelings toward our parents, but we didn't want to worry them anymore. Little by little, our lives started heading in a better direction. And as we slowly got back to being regular middle schoolers, there was one problem. I still wasn't doing well in school. I was never good at studying in the first place. I didn't know how to study, and my test scores were always below average. But then I stumbled onto something that would change everything. It was an old laptop my father gave me. We had used computers in school, sure, but those were school property, so there were limits to what we could do. I could do things like typing out a set passage or looking up something specific. It always felt like a chore, so I never really got into it. But having my own laptop was a whole different story. There were no instructions and no teachers. Just me doing whatever I wanted. I started with web searches, then tried games, printing materials, illustration tools, and various other things. Everything felt fresh and exciting. Then one day, while exploring the computer, I stumbled upon something called programming. At first, I had no idea what I was even looking at. But as I studied, the language that once felt like a secret code slowly started to make sense. That feeling of accomplishment and excitement was addictive. I got hooked right away. What fascinated me most was seeing the program respond exactly the way I told it to. Of course, there were plenty of times when things didn't work at all. But whenever it didn't work, there was always a reason, always a problem somewhere that needed fixing. Finding that mistake was like solving a puzzle. And when I did, the rush of figuring it out was unbeatable. While I was falling deeper into programming, everyone around me was heading into exam season. Since I was still bad at studying, I had to seriously think about whether or not I should even try for high school. One day, while talking to my father about the future, he said, "Just do what you want to do." I kept thinking about those words, and what I really wanted was programming. But there weren't any high schools nearby with an IT program. All the schools around here were general studies, and they just didn't interest me. While I was stuck in that dilemma, Ralph suddenly asked me, "Want to work part-time at my father's factory?" Turns out, Ralph's father's factory was constantly short on staff. Ralph had even started helping out with work recently. I'd never had a part-time job before, so I was nervous. But when Ralph said, "Come on, let's do it together. It'll be fun," I decided to give it a shot. Once I started, the work turned out to be simple packaging tasks. I was pretty good with my hands, so focusing on packing didn't bother me, and chatting with Ralph while we worked made it surprisingly fun. On top of that, the other workers were all kind, and the place had a friendly, welcoming vibe. One day, while I was working my part-time shift, Ralph's father, Mr. Anderson, was muttering to himself, clearly troubled. I asked, "Is something wrong?" He sighed and said, "I'm hopeless with computers." Turned out he'd received some compressed data files and couldn't figure out how to open them. I borrowed his computer for a moment and took care of it. All set. Mr. Anderson was amazed at how quickly I solved the problem. Once he realized I was good with computers, he started giving me data entry and basic document creation tasks. To me, it felt like I was just doing my usual thing. But Mr. Anderson was genuinely impressed with my speed and quality. "Ryan, I'm so glad you're here. You're really helping us out." He said that again and again, and every time it made me incredibly happy. And the work itself was fun. Eventually, I officially started doing computer work as a part-timer. Once that happened, there was one thing I knew I had to do. I wanted to automate the systems. At this factory, everything from invoices and payment tracking to order processing was still done manually. With limited staff, handling everything by hand felt like a major time drain. So I decided to start there and began writing a program. It wasn't easy for me at that time, but it wasn't beyond my ability either. Through trial and error, I eventually succeeded in building a system. Excited, I showed it to Mr. Anderson. I expected him to be pleased, but his reaction went far beyond what I imagined. His eyes lit up as he said, "This is incredible." It was the first time in my life I truly felt that something I made was helping someone else. That moment pushed me to take programming even more seriously. Whatever I learned, I applied directly to improve the company and create real value. It felt rewarding and fun. The more I got into it, the more I realized that I didn't want to go to high school. So, after graduating from middle school, I became a full-time worker at the factory. Once I was on full-time, Mr. Anderson started assigning me all kinds of jobs, and I automated them one by one. I could clearly see how the factory, once inefficient, became much more streamlined. And interestingly enough, as operations became more efficient, the company's performance improved as well. That led to hiring new staff, creating an even stronger cycle of growth. The small-town factory began to grow into a respectable mid-sized company. All starting with automation. Ralph, unlike me, went on to high school. He studied seriously and, after graduation, eagerly joined his father's company. Mr. Anderson had told him he wanted Ralph to take over managing the factory someday. And Ralph threw himself into the work with incredible drive to meet that expectation. It really left an impression on me. Watching him, I often found myself thinking, is this really the same Ralph? And chuckling. I mean, we used to get into all sorts of trouble together, but now it was impossible to imagine him as that rebellious kid. He was that committed. No one ever doubted that he was the factory's future. But the world turned out to be far harsher than we ever imagined. One day, out of nowhere, Ralph died in a car accident. It happened just an hour after he left the office, smiling, saying, "I'm heading out for a sales call." By the time I got the call and rushed to the hospital with Mr. Anderson, it was already too late. I couldn't believe it, that something so tragic could happen so suddenly. Both Mr. Anderson and I collapsed in tears from the shock. The loss hit us so hard, it was difficult to face reality. To us, Ralph had been everything. We couldn't even picture a future without him. But the world kept turning, and so did the factory. So, we had to keep things running no matter what. I buried my grief and forced myself to keep working. Even when I tried to stay focused and push everything else aside, the thought of Ralph would creep in, and I'd be on the verge of tears all over again. But for Mr. Anderson, Ralph's father, the pain must have gone even deeper. He didn't talk much, but he had always watched over Ralph, trusted him, and loved him. Thinking about his pain was heartbreaking. Thank you for always being by Ralph's side. To me, you're like a son too. One night, while we were drinking and reminiscing about Ralph, Mr. Anderson said this to me. Mr. Anderson had always looked out for me. But after Ralph was gone, he treated me even more like family, as if I were filling the space Ralph had left behind. And because I missed Ralph so much, I found myself growing even closer to Mr. Anderson. Then one day, Ralph's older brother, Gerald, returned. He'd hardly ever been mentioned, but I'd heard once that Ralph had a brilliant, genius older brother. Apparently, Gerald had gone to college out of state and even finished graduate school. During all the times Ralph was struggling and when the factory was going through hard times, Gerald never showed up. The first time I ever saw him was sadly at Ralph's funeral. We exchanged only a few words, but he seemed cold, nothing like Ralph. Gerald began helping out at the factory after that. He was a graduate school-educated intellectual. Naturally, I assumed he'd be sharp and help move the company in the right direction. This was the company Ralph had wanted to carry, so I kept working, hoping we could make it even better. But Gerald didn't seem to do much, just stood around observing. He gave off this unapproachable aura, and getting close to him seemed nearly impossible. Then, just when things couldn't seem worse, another tragedy struck. Mr. Anderson suffered a stroke. He suddenly collapsed in front of everyone. But in a twist of bittersweet fortune, it turned out to be a blessing in disguise. We were able to call an ambulance immediately, and he got prompt treatment for the stroke. The surgery was a success, and his life was no longer in danger, but he was left with partial paralysis. Still, I was deeply relieved that he survived. But Gerald wasn't. He used Mr. Anderson's paralysis as an excuse to force him into retirement and took over as president. Since he was technically the successor, no one could really speak out. Once Gerald became president, the company began to shift into a one-man operation. Longtime craftsmen and staff began to openly express their frustration with his leadership. They were clearly worried about where the company was heading. But Gerald kept forcing them out of the company, one after another. Watching all of this unfold, people eventually stopped speaking up. And with no one challenging him, Gerald's high-handed behavior only grew worse. I visited Mr. Anderson in the hospital and told him what was happening. After listening to everything, he looked troubled, but all he could do was smile weakly and say, "Well, I'm in no shape to do anything right now. This company's going to fall apart if things keep going like this." The words burst out of me since I couldn't hold them in. And just my luck, Gerald walked into the hospital room at that exact moment. Did he hear what I just said? I nervously looked at his face, and sure enough, he had heard every word. He was glaring at me with a face full of fury, cold as ice. And from that day on, everything changed. After hearing what I said, Gerald started treating me like a personal enemy. The first thing he did was mock me for not having a high school diploma. He often smirk and say straight to my face, "We don't need someone like you here." From that point on, I was subjected to constant petty harassment. I was completely worn out physically and mentally. Then one day, I made a small mistake. Thankfully, a coworker caught it right away, so it didn't cause any real issues, but Gerald saw it. And of course, he used it as another chance to laugh and sneer. This is why people like you, middle school graduates, are useless. Jobs done by someone like you are worthless anyway. His words made my blood boil. I tried explaining the scope of my work, but Gerald dismissed it immediately, saying, "Anyone can do that." And then he said something outrageous. "You're fired, a middle school graduate. Delete all the data on that computer and get out." At that point, I knew nothing I said would matter. Honestly, I was fed up too. So, I simply said, "Got it." I stood up, ready to leave the company, just as he ordered. But then Gerald added one final insult. "Your system is probably garbage anyway. Wipe everything before you go." He laughed loudly. Hearing that, I just stopped caring. I decided to do exactly as he said, delete everything. Gerald sneered. "Did you really erase everything?" Annoyed by his smug face, I slammed the PC onto the floor with all my strength. The crashing sound echoed through the office, and Gerald's face twisted in shock. Looking him dead in the eyes, I said, "The most reliable way to permanently erase data is physical destruction." Gerald, who was used to dishing out petty harassment, clearly wasn't familiar with this kind of direct intimidation. As I lost it and slammed the computer into the floor over and over, his face grew paler and paler with fear. "Just like you ordered, I've completely erased all data." While I said that with a calm, refreshed expression, Gerald looked completely drained of color. He stood there frozen, staring at me in fear, unable to say a word. A few days later, I was absent-mindedly flipping through a job magazine. What should I do next? I still want to work with programming, I thought. Just as I was lost in those thoughts, my phone suddenly rang. The caller was Gerald. What could he possibly want now? I was a little curious, so I decided to pick up. The very first thing I heard after picking up was Gerald shouting, "Get to the office right now." Of course, I had no intention of going. I said, "I already quit, so no way," and hung up immediately. Calling someone who's already left the company was insane. And to start off with yelling, no chance I'd ever go back. Gerald kept calling me over and over. It was annoying and exhausting, so I decided to just turn off my phone. Even so, I still made visits to see Mr. Anderson. I hated the company now, but Mr. Anderson was a different story. He was like a second father to me, and I wanted to see him and talk to him regularly. That day was my first visit since quitting the company. How are you feeling? When I said that, Mr. Anderson let out a hearty laugh. Still chuckling, he ruffled my hair and said, "It's you more than me. You really made a scene, His expression didn't show anger or sadness, just a strange sense of clarity. Then he began telling me how things were going at the company. He said that after I deleted the system, the order and inventory system wouldn't start up, and it caused a massive disruption in operations. The phone lines were practically exploding from all the supplier calls. They couldn't process incoming orders or order materials, so the factory had essentially come to a halt. Things had gotten so bad that even the employees who had been staying quiet finally started speaking up. On top of that, suppliers were furious, and Gerald was now in serious trouble. I see. So that's how things are. The situation was more serious than I expected, and my voice naturally dropped. But Mr. Anderson just smiled lightly and said, "Yeah, who knows how this will play out." Then, after sharing the current state of things, he let out a sigh and said, "Gerald was always smart. Yeah, I mean, look at his education. It's impressive." There was no denying the truth of that. I listened to Mr. Anderson's story, nodding in agreement. He's always been praised by everyone around him. I think Ralph acted out because he felt like he couldn't measure up. That made sense. Even though I was an only child, I could understand how that would create pressure. No wonder Ralph never really talked about his brother. Mr. Anderson spoke while staring off into the distance. He talked about how Ralph, after turning his life around, earned trust by helping at the factory, how that made Gerald anxious, how Gerald never planned to take over the business in the first place. But when the company started doing well, he suddenly changed his mind. Mr. Anderson spoke with raw honesty, his face full of frustration with his son. After Ralph died, Gerald said he'd take over the company. I told him again and again that this wasn't something he could just jump into on a whim, but he wouldn't listen. He said, "If a guy like you with no education could be president, then I definitely can." He really thought he had it all figured out. He laughed again, that same resigned smile. As I listened silently, Mr. Anderson continued, "But deep down, I always knew it would end up like this. Honestly, I think this is a good thing for Gerald. The company may have taken a big hit, but maybe this was the wake-up call he needed." Then he looked at me again and said, "I'm sorry about my son. I'm sure he said some terrible things to you. Truly, I'm sorry." Seeing him bow his head like that, I felt my anger toward Gerald starting to fade. Gerald may be arrogant and selfish and downright awful, but he's still Ralph's brother and Mr. Anderson's son. Realizing that made me want to forgive him. So, I decided to tell Mr. Anderson something I'd kept secret. Actually, I didn't really delete the data. I just made it look like I did. I backed it up to the cloud. I've hidden it well, so no one will find it easily. Mr. Anderson looked surprised, but I could see a hint of relief on his face. I added, "I can restore everything quickly, so the company itself will be fine." He smiled and said, "I figured you wouldn't really do something that would hurt the company." His words also carried a deeper meaning. "Could you help my foolish son?" Because to Mr. Anderson, Ralph and Gerald were both his precious sons. Thinking that, my heart softened. And before I knew it, the words slipped out. "If it's a request from you, Mr. Anderson, how could I say no?" And just like that, I made up my mind to head back to the company. The moment I arrived at the company, I saw Gerald sitting in front of a new computer, his head in his hands. He must have sensed me watching because he looked up and spotted me. He stood up as if he wanted to say something, but then slumped down again, unable to face me. In a strained, barely audible voice, he said, "I was wrong. Please, I need your help." Without saying a word, I walked over and sat down at the computer, and then I just quietly got to work. Gerald didn't say a thing while I worked. He just stood there and watched. About 30 minutes had passed. The recovery process was complete, and the system was fully restored. Everything that had been a chaotic mess was now back to normal, and Gerald looked stunned. He turned to me, bowed his head, and said, "Thank you." I looked at him and replied, "It's not for you." Then I met his eyes and added firmly, "It's for Mr. Anderson and for Ralph. I know how much they cared about this company, how hard they worked to help it grow. That's why we, the workers, followed them. That's why our relationships with clients were strong. You threw all of that away. This company carries everyone's hopes. As president, you need to treat it with more respect." As I said all of that, Gerald's face twisted and he began to cry. In a voice filled with regret, he said, "I'm sorry." He truly looked like someone reflecting on his mistakes. Then, slowly, he began to speak. "I was jealous of Ralph." I widened my eyes in surprise because his words caught me completely off guard. But Gerald continued, "Ralph had something I didn't. Even when I got perfect scores or became class president, all the attention always went to him, the kid who caused trouble. I'd invite him. I hated him. But Ralph was different. He always looked up to me. He'd smile and say, 'Gerald is amazing.' He was affectionate, always coming to me with respect. So even though I hated him, I could never truly resent him." As he spoke, I could picture Ralph in my mind. The Ralph he described sounded exactly like the kind and warm friend I remembered. Gerald kept talking, slowly opening up. He told me how deeply Ralph's death had affected him. How he tried to take Ralph's place. How becoming president was his way of honoring Ralph. But despite his efforts, all he heard was, "If only Ralph were still here." He struggled every day with the gap between his intentions and the outcome. And when he learned I was Ralph's best friend, it overwhelmed him. "In hindsight, I was taking it out on you." Then he apologized again. "I'm really sorry." As I looked at him, I felt like I was seeing Ralph. Ralph had always been someone who said thank you and sorry sincerely. The way Gerald looked now reminded me so much of that. So his apology felt completely sincere, and I could truly feel it. "Ralph never said much about you, but once he did call you a genius. Someone totally different from me, really smart. He looked up to you. Please don't let him down." Gerald nodded and said, "Thank you." In the end, my termination was canceled, and I returned to the company. Mr. Anderson was discharged from the hospital and began helping out at the company again while going through rehab. Since then, Gerald had changed as if he were a completely different person, listening to those around him and approaching everything with much more care. That said, he had always been talented. He absorbed the good practices with surprising speed, and his leadership quickly earned praise from those around him. On top of that, my relationship with Gerald had become solid. After clashing so hard, we were now able to speak our minds freely, a comfortable and open dynamic. These days, Gerald, Mr. Anderson, and I even go out for drinks together. We'd sit and share stories about Ralph. Of course, about Ralph, most of the stories were wild and ridiculous. But even those stories held glimpses of his unique kindness, and we often end up wiping away tears. The grief of losing a dear friend like him is still deep. It's not something that heals easily, but having people to share those memories with, that's something truly special, isn't it? At least that's how I feel now. And so, as my 10th year as a working adult rolls on with all its ups and downs, I'm still sitting at my desk, working on my computer like always. Next to my monitor is a photo of Ralph smiling. Every time I stretch and glance at that smile, I can't help but smile back. I better get back to work before Ralph yells at me. Thinking that, I found myself smiling even more.